What's up, everybody? Good morning from the CWI Summer Conference. First interview of the day. Thank you for tuning in. I'm joined by my friend Greg Acken, who has been following me on Twitter, and I had no idea.
That's true. That's very true.
So he's been snooping on me
for
a while. But Greg joins me, and your latest book is The Blue-Blooded Cavalryman?
That's correct.
Captain William Brooke Rawle in the Army of the Potomac,
yes.
Correct?
Yes, correct.
And you've done two other books.
Right.
Edited letters.
They were. The first one was called Inside the Army of the Potomac. It was published in 1998 by Stackpole Books. That one was a very good experience. It was really kind of how I cut my teeth in historiography on the process of learning how to really produce that book and transcribe the letters. So I've been on the Civil War Library and Museum's board for about 12 years. Okay. So it kind of, interestingly, the three works that I turned into books were part of the holdings of the Civil War Library and Museum. Wow. So the Donaldson Letters were the first one, as you pointed out. Mm-hmm. That was in 1998 by Stackpole Books. The second one was just recently, but not recent, 2015, called Service with the Signal Corps. It's a memoir of a gentleman named Louis Fortescue, who was actually ironically captured outside of Fairfield, Pennsylvania. He was on Jack's Mountain trying to signal to Little Round Top on the second and third days of Gettysburg, but he was behind Confederate lines, so the Confederates saw him there and went and nabbed his party. Yes.
Wow.
And then most recently, Blue-Blooded Cavalryman, which came out about 2 months ago.
Yeah, that's a brand new one.
It is a new one.
Yeah, that's awesome. And,
yes,
I've seen your other two, and what is it like finding all these letters and having to go through them? And that's a different kind of process than what some of us are used to talking about with just monographs where people have to go to 16 different archives or whatever.
Correct.
When you find all these letters, it has to be like a treasure trove.
It really is. And as anybody who's done it will tell you, the quality of the letters is, they vary. So with these three collections, I just felt that they warranted, I knew they were very good after a read through. So on the first book, Inside the Army of the Potomac, it's a collection of letters. The second book, which you always have to kind of take with a grain of salt, it's a memoir. So it was published, he produced it in the 1880s, 1890s. It was 5 volumes that he had typed up. But you can tell the impact of memory on his recollections. Right. So he was really literally, this guy Fortescue, the signalman, was, I call him an unreconstructed Yankee. I mean, he was taken prisoner, as I mentioned. He spent 18 months in Confederate prisons, and that really tempered his post-war recollections. Right. So that was interesting. And then the most recent collection, as you pointed out, is a set of letters supplemented by a diary. So nice. It's nice to have everything there to work from. I will say, though, there is some repository work that was required, only because you really want to round out their experiences and understand things about other men who may have observed them. Right. And what their impressions of them were, or just to validate their experiences through the eyes of other folks that they served with.
You still have to be a detective.
You still do,
because you have to make sure that story's right.
You do, and I'm glad you brought that up, John. In the Signal Corps book, there were 2 instances where he literally fabricated things. He said he was in battle with the 6th Corps at Chancellorsville when they stormed Salem Heights. His diary in the National Archives, his entries read, I was at a signal station at Fitzhugh's Crossing, which is on the other side of the river south of Chancellorsville. Wow. So there were a couple of instances like that. Now, you say, okay, if he lied there, what else did he lie about? Right. But that's where I went back and did the detective work to validate that everything else he said was fairly accurate. Right. Yeah.
For my audience who are just getting into history or history majors or students, how should they approach a memoir compared to a letter in that way?
It's a great question. Just very carefully. So where detective work, the letters are so immediate, and they're time stamped by the date on them, and I don't think too many people were putting a date on a letter that wasn't accurate when they were writing at home. The memoirs, again, you get influenced by time, by the opinions of fellow soldiers, by things that these guys have read other places. So you have to be very, very careful with the memoir. And as you pointed out with the detective work piece, do the extra detective work.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of like Law and Order.
It is.
Yeah,
it really is.
And it can be drama too.
It is, because the last thing you want to do is validate something that's not true. So and that appears in print, and who does that reflect on? That reflects on me if it's not true. Right.
With this newest work, what was an event in that book that really was like, wow, that's a really neat thing?
It was, the central theme. It became the central theme of his life. Interestingly enough, but in an obituary about William Brooke Rawle, who was in the 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry. They said the person who wrote his obituary said that it was the defining moment of his life. It was the cavalry charge at Gettysburg. So
Really?
right here on the East Cavalry Field. So
Okay.
he had only been in the service for less than 2 months at that time. He graduated from the University of Pennsylvania at 19 years old, went right into the Army before he could even go through the graduation ceremony. 8 weeks later, the 19-year-old is in command of about 20 or 30 men in a company of cavalry, who many of whom are twice as old as him, and participated in a charge that really kind of blunted the force of Stuart's cavalry charge on the third day at Gettysburg. So that was really, for him, it was a defining moment of his life. He wrote about it extensively at the time, but again, he was caught up in the rest of the actions of the war, so couldn't spend a lot of time focusing on it. But in the post-war years, I think he produced 6 monographs about the cavalry battle at Gettysburg.
Wow.
So he spent a lot of time corresponding with his own officers, fellow other Confederate officers, everybody who was there. And there's a fairly thick file at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania of his correspondence, his post-war correspondence with the men who fought there.
I knew that name was familiar to me for some reason. It must have been the post-war monographs that I had seen in the archives years ago or something.
It would make sense.
I remember that name raw from somewhere.
Yes, and it's another odd fact is there is a flagpole out on the East Cavalry Field that is dedicated to the memory of Lieutenant Colonel William Brooke Rawls. So he was only a lieutenant at the time, but he's one of the lowest-ranking officers who served at Gettysburg to have a monument to his memory at Gettysburg.
And that part of the battlefield here at Gettysburg is so often overlooked.
Very much. And I'll be honest with you, I don't mind that. I go out there and I'm one of 3 or 4 people out there. Yeah.
It's not like going to the Virginia Memorial or something.
It's not. And part of it is still an active farm. So that, you have a family there that still actually works the land and the ground over which the cavalry charge took place. But it's pristine.
And when a few of us did the Culp's Hill tour a few months ago, we took the original letters out and we talked about that on the actual ground.
Yeah.
How's that for you when you can go out there knowing these letters even before they go to print in the book, and you're out there experiencing that?
It's amazing. It's amazing. And again, not to jump off Gettysburg, but in the first book, Captain Donaldson, who was with the 118th Pennsylvania, they were in a rearguard action at Shepherdstown on September 20th, just a couple days after the Battle of Antietam, and they got annihilated. They brought 737 men into battle. They lost 269 of them. But I remember I didn't take the actual letters, but I had copies of the letters and went out to Shepherdstown Fort. And it hadn't been studied too much at that point in time, but you're able to read the letters and see the landmarks that he's describing. And there was a bluff that they were caught on top of and literally pushed over the bluff. Some of the men literally went over the cliffs and were injured and killed there. And he talks about some lime kilns at the base of the bluff that they huddled in, but they were hit by Union artillery fire coming over from the other side of the Potomac. But just to be able to see those landmarks and connect them with the letter writer was amazing.
Yeah, and you bring up a great point too with looking at that topography, looking at the lay of the land compared to how they saw it.
Absolutely,
it's so
there's nothing you can't substitute for that. So I'm a sales guy, and if you go and call on an account and you haven't done any homework on the account, it shows. It's just like with the Civil War, with the letters and the diaries. If you don't go out and get a feel for the land, you're not doing it right.
Yeah, I totally understand that, and I know people who have written books on certain things. You could tell they probably didn't walk the ground.
Yes,
and I won't name names. I won't do
that.
but just one of those things.
I'm not one of those people.
No. I can tell. I can tell you're passionate about it. And you can go out and walk that and do that.
Thank you.
But do you have? You just got done with this one.
Yes.
Do you have anything else in mind for future works?
I do. So a couple things. I think prisons have been somewhat overlooked. Again, it's not a powder smoke and gunfire kind of thing, and it's not as maybe sexy as some of the battles. And I know that's not a really good term to use with the battles, but it doesn't attract as much attention as the battles do. So one thing about Fortescue is he had a 5-volume memoir. The 3 volumes that became the book that was published were about his Signal Corps experiences. He left another 2 volumes that deal with his prisoner of war experiences. So that might make I think it might make an interesting book. But again, when you talk about, you really see the impact of memory on those reminiscences, because he was very, very bitter and volatile towards the South. So that's one that I have to weigh very carefully. So that's a potential project. But I've always been there's a couple of different things. I've been fascinated by the heavy artillery regiments that served in the Washington defenses before, and how they literally signed up thinking they were going to kind of coast through the war and just sit in the defenses of Washington and shoot off these large guns. And when the Overland Campaign got hairy, who did Grant call on first?
Right.
These guys who thought they were going to have just an interesting assignment, and they got, overused term, they got put into the meat grinder in the Overland campaign.
Right.
So that's something I'm considering working on. Yeah.
Well, if you do the prison one, I will be very interested in that, because I had an ancestor who died at Andersonville.
Oh, no kidding.
So that's something that we hear so much about Andersonville too.
Yes.
We don't hear about the other prisoner war camps and such.
And somewhat, I won't say rightfully so, but the severity of Andersonville compared to what, he was an officer, Fortescue, the Signal Corps guy who got captured. So was his experience harrowing and physically demanding? It absolutely was. I mean, I think when he came out of prison, he weighed 140 pounds. But compared to Florence or Salisbury or Andersonville, it really it wasn't nearly as harrowing as what your ancestor had to unfortunately pass through.
And I weigh 140 pounds. And I've never been to prison. So don't intend on going. But no, I really enjoy reading these primary documents, because it brings this to life.
Right.
And too often we take secondary sources and we say, okay, that's the way it was. And we forget that you should look at the primary sources, the sources that were made at the time.
Yes.
And really pull something from that. And it's just one of those things where you just got to read for the period.
Couldn't agree more. And that's kind of what got me hooked on it. I mean, I read Catton in college, and then kind of it turned me into an Army of the Potomac disciple. I've always studied the Army of the Potomac, but reading Catton's footnotes and then just kind of going to the next step was, okay, his footnotes were really composed of regimental histories. But what formed the basis for those regimental histories? These guys' letters, their diaries, their recollections, the first-hand accounts, and that's where I think you get a really interesting view of the war, and that's why I really like focusing on the primary accounts.
Was Catton influential for you?
Very much.
Yeah,
very much.
Yeah. See,
even though it was a little bit before my time, but I was very impressed by Catton. It really did. It's what kind of propelled me into doing this.
Really? Yeah. That's kind of a similar story with me. Only I was an 8-year-old nerd.
For you?
who found Catton.
Nice.
And I'm like, oh, this is awesome.
Yeah. Well, first there's that pictorial history, right?
Sure.
Of the Civil War, which he did the writing for, and then of course his trilogy on the Army of the Potomac, in addition to a number of other works that he did.
Right. Yeah. That's really neat. We have that in common as well.
That's great.
So, but again, the name of the newest book is Blue-Blooded Cavalryman, Captain William Brooke Rawl in the Army of the Potomac.
Yes.
And what's the dates from that? May of '63.
So yeah, he joined. He got to the Army May 16th, 1863. He served until August of 1865. They went on occupation duty in Richmond for 2 months after the close of the war.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that's something we don't read about a lot either.
It is. And
Yeah.
it was again very tedious. They were basically the provost marshal. He characterized them as mounted police. So there was. When you define tedium, it's kind of those 2 months that he spent in Richmond. He said the rations were poor, it was too hot, and all we were doing was just policing, and he didn't enjoy that part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Especially compared to what had gone before.
A little bored.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
I hear about that with World War II vets too. Occupation duty was boring.
That's right.
Compared to what it was.
Yes.
Same thing.
Yes.
It's a universal thing.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Greg, for coming on the live stream.
Thanks, John.
I'm sure a lot of my friends and followers will be interested in reading these works, and I will actually be uploading this to YouTube later, and I'll give you an Amazon link so you can check out all of Greg's work. So thank you again, my friend, for coming on.
I appreciate it.
We'll talk to you soon with more interviews.